A typical publisher with a mobile app, say a news app, who has about 2 million daily users and has integrated Google AdMob, Meta Audience Network, etc., and has a decent user base. On average, such a publisher, if they dig deep, they'll understand that their fill rates are stuck at around 30%, render rates at about 40%, which means essentially this publisher is monetizing only about 12% of their ad inventory.
Like I said, it's a black box. You are not privy to what eCPMs they bid at, who bid for Google, whether Meta is bidding or AppLovin is bidding or somebody else. There are so many other networks, but you have no clue which one is bidding at what rate.
I brought, say for example, 100 apples to the market, and it's a perishable commodity at the end of the day. I've only been able to sell 12. And 88 apples have just gone away and, but they have to be thrown away. So when you think of it like that as a perishable product or a commodity which is available only for a short duration of time, and the fact that, you have not done the best that you could possibly have to monetize it. And that precisely is what meta mediation is, because it is basically creating this marketplace to which I alluded earlier inside your app, in your environment, where you have control over a lot of the ad opportunities and to see which mediator actually gets to show the ad. That control deserves to be back with the publisher. It deserves to be with them because they own the inventory. From a non-meta mediation setup to a meta mediation setup, publishers are able to gain at least 50 to 60% in terms of a monetization boost when it comes to meta mediation. Simply by having the power to flip and configure and add more combinations and see what the true value of their inventory is.
You're basically saying, I'm going to improve your efficiency, but I'm also going to add competition into the network. So one is getting higher revenues, whatever, all the 12%, 14%, 20% increase and all that stuff, right? But think about the bottom line, right? You don't have to put any more ad engineers, right? You don't have to put any more engineers on making this one work, do all this experiment. All this just goes away. It's just out of the box for you. So if I've saved on 2 engineers, I've saved on 2 engineers, man, that is bottom line. Forget the revenue uplift.
The adoption has increased in the sense that publishers have started to become more aware, and the term itself is not new to them. So they recognize what meta mediation is. The term they recognize. They may not completely fathom how it works, what it does, what all it happens.
Hello and welcome back to a brand new episode of the Adster Podcast, episode 8. Today I'm here with Girish and Ranga, and we're going to talk about meta mediation. Now, before we start, let me paint a picture. A typical publisher with a mobile app, say a news app, who has about 2 million daily users and has integrated Google AdMob, Meta Audience Network, etc., and has a decent user base. On average, such a publisher, if they dig deep, they'll understand that their fill rates are stuck at around 30%, render rates at about 40%, which means essentially this publisher is monetizing only about 12% of their ad inventory. Now, this is quite common, but what publishers do is they look at what revenue they make from each ad network and just leave it at it. Very few monetization leaders look at the data to see if they're actually getting the best value for their ad inventory. So today we are going to understand why traditional mediation hits these walls and explore something called meta mediation that represents a fundamental shift in thinking. Girish, Ranga, welcome to the show. Now, I know our audience ranges from seasoned AdOps professionals to app developers who are just getting serious about monetization. Let's start with the basics, Ranga. For someone who's maybe just integrated their first ad network, what exactly is ad mediation?
You should really think like an ad mediation is a different thing, right? So what basically happens with AdMob or with GAM or with multiple ad mediation networks is it's kind of a black box for a publisher, right? So you integrate one SDK and then assuming I'm using AdMob, right? That is probably the most entry point for the smaller publishers or even mid-sized publishers in that sense. So basically Google does all your bidding for you and they set a price and they send you an ad, you display an ad and that's the end of it, right? So you're really not doing any ad mediation by yourself, right? Basically Google does everything on its own. And then, like I said, it's a black box. You are not privy to what eCPMs they bid at, who bid for Google, whether Meta is bidding or AppLovin is bidding or somebody else. There are so many other networks, but you have no clue which one is bidding at what rate, right? So you are getting an ad from AdMob or GAM and then you're displaying that, right? And then eventually you get a report saying this was your average CPM, this is how much impressions you made, what was the CTR, and what was the final ad revenue look like. So, I mean, that I think is very basic understanding of what an ad mediation network does, right? So in that sense.
I've heard about this concept called waterfall concept, where the logic of rendering ads happens. This is the black box you're essentially talking about. But the publisher rarely understands.
So when you say waterfall, I would think, right? So I made a request for AdMob or GAM, right? And I didn't get an ad, right? So what do I do next, right? So I will have to call another ad mediation partner, or I have to call another RTB partner or whatever, right? So I have to know, okay, I didn't get a fill from the first part, and then I have to call another ad request, or I have to do a retry request. So basically waterfall, like, right, the first request is done, I didn't get a fill, I make the second request, then I make the third request or a fourth request, right? So that is your typical waterfall model.
But the publisher has very little or no control as to...
Yeah, it becomes complex for the publishers because they will have to implement all this stuff on their own. So they're basically app developers, right? If you think about it, right? So they're more focused on getting their traffic for their app. They're trying to see what I can do with this app, what more features are there for the app, what do I need to keep make user retention on the app. So they're not so much on the ads. Ads is, although it is their main source of revenue, but they're still not very well equipped to handle ads in that sense. Because it is, like I said, no, it is a complete black box, and it's very hard to understand what is going on behind AdMob or GAM or whichever ad mediation network that they use. Could be Unity tomorrow, or could be AppLovin. There are many more like that right now.
Depending on the type of publisher, they choose the right. Fair enough. Now, Girish, the statistics I mentioned earlier, 30% fill rates, 40% render rates, and monetization of only about 12% of the ad inventory. Now, these numbers seem pretty terrible. Are these actually typical for mid-sized publishers too?
Yeah, and it was equally surprising for us when we sort of started out. We thought these numbers would be significantly better from a publisher's perspective, of course. So it was kind of a wake-up call, if you ask me, when we started going in and talking to publishers saying, look, the problem does seem to be far more acute than what we thought, it would be. And that's where, we realized that the inefficiencies that exist today, the publishers are just not prepared for it, right? Because a lot of the data which is underlying this entire ad serving piece, like what is the match rate or the fill rate, what is the show rate or the render rate, is kind of lost in this entire muddle where you're still thinking about it in terms of, okay, can I get another partner to bid? Or can I get another network? Can I integrate one more partner? But you're not really looking at what it's generating. You're not looking at the fact that, I brought, say, for example, 100 apples to the market, and I've actually had to, and it's a perishable commodity at the end of the day. And I've had to, I've only been able to sell 12, and 88 apples have just gone away, and, they have to be thrown away. So when you think of it like that, as a perishable product or a commodity which is available only for a short duration of time, and the fact that, you have not done the best that you could possibly have to monetize it, it is not so much about the absolute number. It is not about, did I make $10,000 or $20,000? Could I have made $50,000 or $100,000 is what, it basically translates to, because it's the opportunity cost or the possible extra revenue that you could have made that you're leaving on the table.
I think when we talk about the 12%, the scarier part is the other 88% which is just lost.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking about just before the recording, you said something that the number one problem with what publishers face is they don't know how to value their ad inventory.
Yeah.
They don't know if a particular CPM, let's say $25 is high or low. $5 is too low, or is it absolutely okay? The second best or the next best thing a publisher could possibly do is allow multiple networks or multiple partners to bid to determine the better cost. Right. If you just go to one or two ad networks, you will get and you take what you get.
Absolutely.
Right? Essentially, that is what happens.
Exactly.
Right.
Also, if you think of it in terms of like a marketplace, right? In a truly fair and, transparent marketplace system, you have buyers and you have sellers. And everybody is able to see how the true price discovery is happening. Now, Ranga alluded to, how the mediation networks operate like a black box. what does it mean? You never know what the people who were bidding are bidding for, and what were the other bids, what was finally the winning bid, essentially, right? And that price discovery is what leads to you understanding the value of your inventory. So in a true marketplace, if you don't have one externally, as a publisher, then the other next best alternative is for you to create one in your app. So how do you create an auction system, right? Which is what we are talking about today.
I think, Ranga, coming back to you, you mentioned that setting up all these things for, let's say, first-time publisher is way too complex. And their primary focus will always be to drive traffic, keep people on their apps or site. And while ad revenue is a decent source of revenue, but technically they may not have bandwidth to look at how to solve this. From a technical standpoint, why can't publishers fix this? Is it just because they don't have the resources, or fundamentally their approach to, for example, I keep hearing that monetization should be treated or approached like product development. You have to constantly iterate, you have to deeply understand what you're getting and what you're not. But if bandwidth of resource is a major constraint, or if that is the only reason, why can't publishers fix this?
No, I think it takes a lot of engineering effort to actually get to a point of saying, okay, now, assuming I'm making $100 today, right? So I just made $100 from AdMob or GAM or whichever mediation network is, right? And you talked about how much 12%, 15%, 20%, you can get to 30%, right? You're still leaving 70% on the table, right? So there is two thought processes to it, right? So one is getting the eCPM higher, or getting more fill rate, or getting all this stuff, right? Like I said, if they have one SDK, right, that they have integrated, right? And this, because it is an app, right? So every time you make a change to your code, you have to release a new version. That means you have probably a 25-day or 30-day release cycle, and then you make one change, you release that into the market and then into the store, and then people upgrade. So there is one version which has some coordinate, there is another version which has another version of the coordinate. So you'll have to keep track, okay, how much was this version making and how much is this version of the app making, right? So every iteration requires a public release, right? And people and the existing users have to upgrade to that, right? So it is a very long drawn process, right? So you make a mistake in one release, so you have to wait to make another one and wait for the users to upgrade to the other one, right? So it is a lot of engineering resources, a lot of time spent trying to fix something. So imagine if you're trying to fix something, you have never an opportunity to actually go and do an experiment, right? Whether it has worked or not worked. Then you're stuck with that, right? It's constant loop, right? You're always going through this loop.
Fair. So is it fair to say that a publisher, only when they make a certain decent amount of ad revenue, then they can actually think of investing in these engineering resources? I
Correct.
think that is
right?
when...
So like I said, no. So there are other problems in the app itself, right? They're also constantly evolving, right? They're trying to add new features, and that also has to make it into the market, into the Play Store or into the App Store, wherever, right? It's iOS or Android. It is the same process, right? So it is a week-long process at minimum. At least it takes 1 or 2 days for App Store or Play Store to give you the approval, and then it takes another 3-4 days for the users to use the upgrade to that version. So the complexities are there. It takes a long time. It is not like in a typical web world, you could make the changes, get rid of the cache, and then have the deployment very quickly. But whereas in this case, it is not that easy. So you have to be really have a decent plan on what am I going to do there, right? And especially if the number of users are high, it is going to be even more harder, right? So you will have like 70% of users in the latest version, some 20% on the previous version, and another 10 to 5%, and keeps going. It's a long tail, right? Everybody has some different version of the app on their phone, and they're running different things. So you really have to monitor everything that's going on, not just in your app world, but in the ad side also, right? How much each version of the app is generating for you.
I mean, this conversation feels like opening, these layers of onions to understand. So to empathize with publishers, I feel that it is not necessarily their shortcomings, but systematically itself, it's very inefficient because there are so many players. Your core product itself is so complicated. That is your primary focus. And add to it different ad networks. It's systematically like I can talk about an analogy of ICE, internal combustion engine versus electricity. Electric vehicles are far more efficient in converting electricity into motion. Whereas petrol or diesel, I think nearly 50 to 60% is just lost in heat. That is
that has been solved to a larger extent. I don't think that.
It's improving, but probably, I'm not an advocate of electric vehicles anyway, but it's a sufficient, maybe a much more efficient way of storing energy and utilizing it in another format, maybe. So, one thing which I constantly read about is from a publisher's perspective, when they think about ad monetization and making more money, they think about adding more demand, more ad networks, more demand. But
so in an ideal world, you would want, like Girish talked about, right? You would want to create a marketplace where everybody comes in and then you decide which one, right? Which has got the highest bid. And then you say, okay, this network is giving me $5. This one is giving me $1. This one is giving me $2. This one is giving me $3 or whatever, right? And then you choose from there, right? But that requires a lot of engineering complexity, right? So that means if I just for the sake, right? Just for you give an example, GAM and AdMob don't tell you upfront, okay, what the bid price is, right? So they will tell you after the ad has come, after you made the request, after the impression has been shown, you can actually find out what the eCPM was for that particular ad. But they won't tell you upfront, right? So that means you're still working with a black box. You really don't know whether, if you had another bid, right? Forget the complexity of integrating the other ad network partners, but you don't know whether the other bid was higher than the one. So you will have to figure out what was the effective average for the last 4 days, assuming that. And then if GAM or AdMob gave you a request, you assume what the average eCPM was. And then if you have another network which is higher, then you figure it one out, right? So that means there is a lot of work on the back end for you to figure out what was the average for the last 2 days. And then you would have had to integrate your open RTB partners or any other mediation partners which have given you eCPM. I'm assuming there are some partners which give you eCPM, but then imagine the complexity that actually gets into, right? And this is happening at a millisecond level, right? You have to decide saying, okay, my last average CPM was like $2 from GAM or AdMob, which that is my primary mediation, right? And then if I have AppLovin or my own Prebid or Pubmatic, or there are many other which give you some certain eCPM, then you will have to figure out, integrate all of them, make a request to them also at the same time, figure it out, and then say, okay, what was the average here was 1 and I got 1.1, so I pick up the 1.1 and then show an ad. So imagine the complexity there, right? And it is happening on the device. It is not happening at the back end, right? All this needs to happen on your Android phone or an iPhone.
Correct. That is true. So essentially what you're talking about is meta mediation, creating this marketplace and, this competition.
Correct. So you basically create, when I say meta mediation, my thought process is like I have all these mediation partners. Can I actually mediate these mediation partners, right? So, because they are all kind of, like I said, black box, right?
Now, I think this is a nice segue to the concept of meta mediation. Girish, so traditional mediation has some pretty fundamental limitations because of the black box nature. Now, in simple terms, how is meta mediation different from ad networks? Is it just the concept of making the ad networks compete? And Ranga eloquently talked about how if the publisher has to pick up the gauntlet and do everything on their own, it becomes nearly impossible to do it manually. When that is where the technology of meta mediation partners like us, what we do, matters. So how is meta mediation different from just adding ad networks?
Ranga already described that the mediation layer operates like a black box, right? So mediation by itself is essentially mediating across networks, right? Or demand partners. So the mediator acts like a consolidator or the person running the auction to decide which of the 4, 5, 10, 15, 20 networks who are participating in this auction deserves to win the bid, right? In most cases, the mediator is also the decider, is also one of the networks which is bidding, which makes this entire, system, very, very much like a black box, because you don't know if there is a conflict of interest between the mediator and the other bidders. Now, to a large extent, because of the dynamics of the industry, this has kind of gone to a place where Google, being Google, is able to sort of, arm twist or whatever else their way into controlling or getting all the networks to bid into them. So they are one. Similarly, there are others like, AppLovin, there is others like Unity. It's because of the sizable control they have over the supply, right, that they are able to do this. Now, if you take the example of Meta Mediation, essentially what we are saying is we are taking one step before the mediation network. So today, in today's context, what typically happens is that you choose one mediation part, right? The reason you have to choose is because if you're choosing AdMob or GAM or you're choosing AppLovin or Unity, they will decide which networks to mediate, and they will have the last say when it comes to sending you an ad or a bid. Should you, in today's context, introduce another mediation network, there is a certain amount of complexity that you're introducing in this equation, because now you will have the mediation network is not telling you the price of the bid that they are that for that winning ad. So now, how do you decide on your own between two mediators who deserves the opportunity to show the ad? So that's the complexity, and that's purely because of the lack of transparency and the way the industry has evolved that this has happened. Now, in a truly fair system, ideally what is happening is the mediator is also like a network. I mean, they may have mediated across, say, 10 networks and given you a bid. But if they give you a price and you had similarly the price from other mediators who are working with 10 other networks, then you could decide which of these two deserves to win the opportunity to show the ad. And that precisely is what meta mediation is, because it is basically creating this marketplace to which I alluded earlier inside your app, in your environment, where you have control over a lot of the ad opportunities and to see which mediator actually gets to show the ad, right? That control deserves to be back with the publisher. It deserves to be with them because they own the inventory. Again, taking the analogy of the apple farmer, if the apple farmer should be the one deciding who they sell their inventory to, it cannot be the middleman who decides, this is the person, give them your entire produce, right? That it doesn't sound fair. So that's the concept of meta mediation, is essentially moving this idea of a marketplace into the app to very close to the inventory. That gives the publisher more control to decide who wins the opportunity to show the ad.
Like you said, I think typically publishers sort of integrate one ad network or one mediation partner. It's not enough that you have a mediation technology in your app, but it's about how transparent they are. Otherwise, then what is the point of mediation if you don't know how much you are being priced at? So, Ranga, from a technology perspective, so meta mediation is a piece of technology like an SDK integrated into the app. And you spoke about how so much of the manual work a publisher would have to do. How will this piece of technology, like let's say Adster's meta mediation product, would make it easy or eliminate most of these things for a publisher?
So I started with AdMob, right? And then I found I was making $100 with AdMob. Then I went to Unity. Now I've seen publishers do this, right? They move from one mediation network to another mediation network to another mediation network, right? And then with Unity, for a month they made 120, but the next month it went back to 80. So imagine they've already lost 2 months trying to understand, okay, which mediation network is doing better for them, right? And eventually they ended up in the same spot. The average is still 100, right? What our solution does is basically gives you a choice to pick up whatever mediation network you want, right? At the same time, you don't have to do any changes. You integrate one piece of SDK, one piece of code, and pretty much everything is controlled through our configs. And you can run experiments with multiple stuff. And like I said, no, it is a simple half a day, I've seen publishers do the integration in half a day or sometimes even half an hour. That's all it takes actually, right? And then all of these, like we talked about, right? Getting the best bid for you from the publisher perspective, getting all the mediation networks we call the mediation networks, we do all the stuff internally and send you back the best possible bid for you. all this comes bundled, and you can do this in half an hour or half a day.
Okay. Now, in terms
So
of
it is that simple in that sense.
fair. In terms of data, what kind of data do we surface, which traditional mediation networks does not, to the publisher? Meaning, do we disclose ECPMs? Do we disclose the highest bidder? Do we disclose all bids? How does this thing work from a...
Like I said, no, it is all bundled in one small piece of SDK, right? So you can get what was the bid price, what was the impression, how much was the impression, what did you sell it for, which one actually won, which mediation network won, and how much was there for each one, which mediation network won for a certain device. All the data is already there for you, right? You can come on, log into our dashboard, and you can see pretty much all of these data directly.
So from an engineering architecture point of view, you said that the integration is not so complex. Anywhere between half an hour to just
half a day,
half a day, you can get it integrated. Right. This sounds like from outside in look, meta mediation, creating this this marketplace, and it sounds a little complex, even though from a setup point of view it may be, but from a publisher point of view, it sounds very complex. Do you, when you guys talk to publishers, what is the perception? What is their perception of meta mediation? Do they feel it is a little too overwhelming, too new, or is it purely because of very little awareness and education about?
I don't know. I think we've had mixed reviews, right? There are some where we have seen they really like what we have already built and they want to adapt it as soon as possible. But for some, there needs to be some awareness saying, okay, what all we have done, what does it encompass for you, what does it get you? In the end, all that stuff is there. And for some are very skeptical, saying, oh, is this really possible? Right? So I would say it is a mixed bag. I wouldn't say it is. Yeah, but I think the more we see, I think most people starting to understand this one now, saying, okay, can I do all the three together? Yes. So that kind of helps out.
Right. Fair enough. Girish, on an average, how aware are publishers about the concept of meta mediation itself? I think our product comes second, but as a concept itself, how many monetization leaders at, say, mid-level publishers are actually aware of this? What is your read of the...
Well, unfortunately, not enough. Woefully so. The numbers are, the number of... also, I think what's happened, and just giving more context on the industry and the way it's evolved, publishers have always been left holding the wrong end of the stick, if you know what I mean. And even though they own the inventory, right? So I like to take the example of the apple farmer because, at the end of the day, the farmer is the one growing the produce. But they are the ones probably making a fraction of what the middleman or the middlemen are making as the produce reaches the market, right? So in this entire unfair system, the publishers have over a period of time lost big time, despite owning the inventory, despite what Ranga mentioned about, putting in the hard work in terms of growing their app, getting the traffic on board, making sure they're giving users a good experience, all of that. But then, they're not able to fully enjoy the benefits of this app monetization that they possibly could have, right? So there is definitely an awareness problem. There is also a trust problem, rightly so, because they've been taken for a ride for far too long. And, people, networks come in, make promises about the quantum of increase in revenue, etc., the demand they have, what they can give them, etc., etc. And unfortunately, this has led to a kind of a fear psychosis that, this is this the next big scam waiting to happen to me? So they become wary. Obviously, they have a lot of questions around, how does the technology work? What exactly do you do under the hood? How are you going to make sure this will work in our favor, etc., etc. So from a publisher standpoint, they're not wrong in terms of where they are and what they're experiencing, because that's their reality. But when you look at technology, the way it's evolving and what it can deliver today. So our attempt at Adster has really been to condense a huge amount of technology expertise and domain expertise. Because a lot of this, like Ranga explained earlier, is very iterative. You will try, you will find it does not work, then you will shift, then you will try, then if you find it doesn't work, then you move to approach C, D, E, and so on and so forth. So for a publisher to continue to do this is exhausting for something that is not something that you understand too well in the first place to begin with, right? You've not built the app for ads. You built it. You're looking for monetization. So you want ads. You have user attention. You're monetizing that attention through ads. And that's where publishers need external help. They need somebody who can just give them like a plug and play solution that fits into their entire stack. And they don't give up control also, right? So we at Adster, our emphasis is they retain the power to iterate, but they don't have to, have this huge dependency on the product, on the technology teams on their end to be able to do those iterations. And it happens with full transparency. So they are in control. They know what's happening inside their apps, which networks are bidding, how they're bidding, who's taking away a line share, who's not performing, who needs to be sort of, maybe removed from that bidding ecosystem, etc. So that's giving more power and control and transparency back to the publishers.
I think another misconception which we have been very vocal about recently is that publishers always have to balance, user experience and ads. So there is this misconception that more ad revenue means I have to show more ads, which means user experience gets affected, which they don't want. Sometimes ads which were not rendered because of poor setup, just by tweaking a little bit behind the scenes, might grow the fill rate. And the publisher might look at it and say, oh, am I showing more ads? Is this why I'm getting more ad revenue? I think this mediation meta mediation as a concept also has to be rooted in the context of you can make more money purely by competing, making your mediation partners and networks competing for your inventory and not necessarily showing more ads. I think a lot of awareness also has to be generated on that. Is it a fair comment to say that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, obviously, you have goals, business goals as a publisher. You want to generate more revenue. But if you're operating at 12%, you obviously have to generate more produce because your efficiency is 12%, right? Now, if that same thing could be 70 or 80%, then you'd be in a totally different mindset, right? Because then you're not compromising user experience in order to show it. But you've accepted 12% as your reality. So now you are thinking that, this is the only way I can do this.
Right. Fair enough. I want to come back to the 12% which you mentioned, Girish. With meta mediation, what kind of improvement are we actually talking about here? If I'm a typical publisher stuck at 12% of monetizing my ad inventory with traditional mediation, what's realistic with meta mediation? Let's say in a span of 3 to 6 months.
So numbers typically vary based on the type of setup that a particular publisher has and so on and so forth. But on an average, we have seen that from a non-meta mediation setup to a meta mediation setup, publishers are able to gain at least 50 to 60% in terms of a monetization boost when it comes to meta mediation. Simply by having the power to flip and configure and add more combinations and see what the true value of their inventory is. So a lot of the
I want to interrupt here. Yeah. Right? So it's not just increasing the 12% to something else number, but it is also getting your competition going, right?
Yeah.
So people are under the assumption that if I'm showing more ads and I have lesser eCPM, that means I'm showing more ads, but I'm making the same amount of money. Or I could be showing better ads, show lesser ads, but make the same amount of money, right? So it's a combination of both, right? You cannot let one go and keep the other one, or the other one go and keep the other one, right? So you have to, which is where meta mediation comes into play, right? So you're basically saying, I'm going to improve your efficiency, but I'm also going to add competition into the network, right? It's not purely saying I'm going to get your fill rate higher and all that stuff, right? But by adding competition, one is you're going to get, if one person is not bidding, there might be other two networks which might be bidding, right? And between those two, you still pick the best one. If two are not bidding and if I have the third one, that means my fill rate is still getting better, right? So it's not necessarily I'm going to go show no ads there, right? I will have some ads to show because I already made up my mind. I'm going to show an ad here, right? So I'm increasing the efficiency, but I'm also getting the competition to bid more on that one. So because eventually they will also realize that they will have to start bidding more, right? Because this is getting a better premium inventory. Most publishers don't understand what premium inventory is, or they just say, okay, I've integrated ad mob, whatever ad comes, right? So I show it to them.
Typical marketplace economics, right? Again, so there's supply, there's demand. But if you keep increasing the supply, what happens is that you value your inventory less. And so when, to the same example, if you have become more efficient and that 12% has now become, say, 70%, the bidders also realize that if I want this inventory, I will need to start bidding higher, or I will have to compete harder to get this, because definitely there is more to be had here.
So with meta mediation, a publisher may increase the amount of ads, but that is not the primary focus. The focus is you make it more efficient. You make many partners bid so that the value of each ad slot goes.
Yeah.
And like Ranga said, you can make the same amount of money by showing fewer ads, or you may choose to increase the number of ads and make more money considerably. So 12%, so to about, let's say, even 50% or 70%, that's a dramatic improvement. That's nearly 5 times the improvement. If it is so much better, why aren't monetization leaders trying more to understand, spend more time to understand, publishers more time to understand meta mediation as a solution? Is awareness the only challenge here?
It is. It is also a question of, if it's worked for them, will it work for me? I need to see the proof of the pudding. All the reasons I described earlier: trust, lack of transparency. Also, if you know how the networks, if you look at how the networks operate today, right? Networks take your inventory, they monetize it, they get paid, and then they take their cut and they pay you, right? So that's the way that entire funnel operates. But today, if as a publisher, you have greater control in terms of what price, of driving the price up through the bidding process, adding more partners, creating more competition, then you are in greater control of this entire funnel, because now you know the true value and you are able to say, okay, if I sold an X number of impressions this month, then I'm definitely making an X amount of money. It is now not left completely to the discretion of the network or the mediator to say, okay, what was the actual monetization for my inventory?
Fair. Okay. Now, Ranga, I want to talk about the practical side of introducing meta mediation. So if I'm a publisher running about 2 million DAU on my app, and I'm convinced meta mediation is the way to go forward, you touched upon how easy it is to integrate anywhere between half an hour to half a day. What am I actually signing up for, and what does the implementation actually look like? So what is going to happen in that one day when I'm integrating this from a engineering perspective? What happens behind the scenes?
Like I said, no, it will probably take a seasoned developer, maybe 1 hour to integrate and start seeing their test ads and all the stuff before we go into production. So we have a test setup. They can just come, use our SDK from our Maven, and then test ads are already configured, and they can start seeing all formats and all flavors of ads, all different sizes. Like a seasoned developer would probably do it in like 2 hours max, and you can start seeing test ads. So that is how easy the implementation looks like today.
For a mid-level publisher, however, who
it's the same. The implementation is the same for irrespective of what size the app is, how many DAUs are there, how many MAUs are there, how big they are. It doesn't matter. The implementation is very similar. It doesn't change.
So just to add to what Ranga said, right? So the process is very similar to how you would work with a network today. There's documentation available. There is, any app developer who's already built the app and used ads in the past simply has to follow that. And like Ranga said, the process or the steps involved are the actual integration, which is the code. That's one part of it. The second part is where they actually see whether the code is working, the test ads are coming, etc., etc. Then comes the part around configuring it to see if the actual ads, which are the real live ads, are actually being coming into their app, which requires a little bit of config from their side also in terms of ad units, etc. So those are, like you said, the entire process end to end is no more than like a half a day process to a day at best for somebody who's really devoting the time to it and seeing if it, it wants to get it done in that span of time.
Right. One thing you talked about, Girish, is building trust or the lack of trust around what is being promised by vendors to publishers. Let's talk about risk. With Meta Mediation, once integration happens, what happens if something goes wrong during transition? So initially, for the first month or so, as the technology tries to understand the setup and tries to understand where ad bidding is coming from, etc., will the revenue dip slightly before it picks up? What does the initial period look like for a publisher who introduces Meta Mediation for the very first time?
A good question, because I think this is also a segment of how we do it today. So the way it operates is that once that initial technical integration phase is over, they've configured ad units and set it up, and we start to see live ads. There is never a big bang approach where we say, okay, we're going to just take over all the inventory in one go and run it through the new setup. We do a gradual transition from their existing setup to the new setup. And there are two reasons for that. One is also to build confidence for the publishers to see for themselves what the results are and what the difference is that Meta Mediation can bring. So we retain their existing ad setup. We are able to fork, or rather they actually are the ones who do it. They take a percentage of their traffic and they route it to the new setup. Now this is as simple as making a call saying load ad, right? Which is essentially what you would have done to your old at your old setup, to your existing mediation stack. You will now call Adster and say load ad, the same call that you would make, right? And what that is doing is that it is giving them a safe, risk-free path to seeing exactly how that happens.
So think about it this way, right? So I integrated the SDK and then I'm ready to go, right? So I am not going to do it on 100% of my users, right? Most of the users have kind of a beta setup. So they put that in their beta setup, right? So maybe it is 1,000 users or 10,000 users, right? Just to ensure that it is not causing crashes in the app, it is not causing delay, it is not doing all the stuff, right? Once they get comfortable with the beta setup, then they increase it to 5% over a week and then monitor the results, right? So actually more than them, we monitor the results for themselves, right? So it's not necessarily they are monitoring, but we are also monitoring in the same sense, right? So and then it increases to 10%, 20%, and gradually over a period of a month or 45 days, it gets to 80 to 95% of the user base.
Fair. I think this is a nice segue. So timeline wise, if a publisher makes a decision to move forward today and integrate Meta Mediation, to see the numbers which you're talking about, Girish, 12 to 70 or even 50% or even doubling what their current setup is, what time are we looking at timeline-wise? So if it takes about a month or 45 days to implement Meta Mediation across 100% of all the audience.
So one is the publisher saying, okay, I'm going to do this in 15 days, 30 days, 45 days, right? And it is also how many users have upgraded to their new version, right? So I made a release today, right? So that means I probably will take another week for my users to come on to that latest version. Some users might take much longer, right? Depending on app to app. So it does vary from 45 days to 2 months. So it's not necessarily going to be, I put the SDK today, tomorrow I'm going to see double. No, it might not work right away. Because it is not necessarily a function of the Meta Mediation SDK. It's also a function of users upgrading to the latest version of the app and how many percentage of users have upgraded and how many percentage of users have you released this new version, right? So it is combination of all of these factors.
Again, from what we've seen, 8 to 9 weeks is a fair sort of a guesstimate to say. Again, depends a lot on the publisher, how fast they do things and how quickly they move and what their release cycle is, etc. But at 8 to 9 weeks, you would have a clear sense of, directionally, this is something that is working for us. It is definitely working for us. And, if I move a huge chunk of my users, then I'm going to be making, significantly more money.
So I want to zoom out a little bit, Girish. How old is this concept of Meta Mediation as a productized version? I mean, what generated this evolution?
It's not very old. and that explains why there's a lot of awareness that needs to be still be created around it. It is largely restricted to the app environment, obviously, because mediation exists in the app environment. It is dominated by a few large or 3 or 4 different large mediation networks who obviously don't want things to change, because it means that it will mean there'll be a new equilibrium in the market, right? So it is, as a concept, I would say it is something that is emerging today. And if I could just borrow from Gartner's hype cycle, I would probably put it on, somewhere on the early part of the hype cycle itself. The part about meta mediation is that as the more publishers who have experienced it go out there and put their stories out and talk about it, it will help others also gain confidence in what it does for them, right? Because at the end of the day, we have to see this as an initiative which is building greater transparency for the industry at large. It is trying to disrupt the existing stranglehold that the large mediation players have over this industry. And for that to happen, there has to be a lot more done. Obviously, we talk to a lot of industry bodies ourselves. We try and create awareness through podcasts like these, but it would help if publishers also, talk about this and discuss this in the forums that they are in, so that it becomes a much bigger, gets a lot more momentum as well.
I feel that the meta mediation is equal part evolution as well as revolution.
Yeah.
Because if you literally have to give control back to the publisher, it is literally a revolution.
Correct.
Because like you said, they have been taken for a ride for so long. Talking about from a publisher's perspective, if somebody has to walk up at the publisher's office, walk up to the head of monetization and have to sell meta mediation, saying, why don't we go ahead? From a tactical perspective, what is the decision framework? How would someone evaluate, or how would I convince my superior to take a look or consider meta mediation? What do you say?
It's a question of I have an X amount of inventory. Today, that's a finite amount of inventory, which are, obviously ad slots, monetizable ad slots that I have available. I am doing an X amount of revenue, and there's this shiny new thing that's in the market. You can call it whatever you want, but it's supposedly going to make me extra money, right? So the devil is in the details, because essentially what people are going to want to see is the question that comes down to how. Like, is it going to mean more impressions? Is it going to mean more demand? Is my eCPM going to go up? How are you exactly going to do it? And by how, I don't mean the technical part of it, but during that decision-making process, it is about, we talked about the formula for revenue monetization, right? The formula is simple. It is number of impressions multiplied, which is actually delivered. So that means your fill rate multiplied by your render rate multiplied by your eCPM is what tells you exactly how much money you're going to be making. So if you move, unless you have significantly improved one of these 3 parameters, you won't see an improvement in revenue, right? And that is where the conversation really hinges. So in fact, this is one of the common things that we hear from publishers. They come back to us and say, are you going to improve eCPM? Are you going to improve my fill rate? Do you have new demand, right? So obviously that's going to mean better fill rate. Or almost nobody ever asks us about render rate, because everybody thinks or believes they already do what needs to be done on the render. But when you look at the details and you look at the actual monetization numbers, the efficiency stats, right? That's where you actually realize how much money is being left on the table. So one of the ways that we go about it today is we can also help them with an audit, of course, but it's to simply look at the data that they have available from the last year and see the numbers for themselves in terms of where they're at. The conversation then becomes largely about, what is the percentage or the extent of improvement you can bring, right? And that's where I think from our standpoint, at least at Adster, what we've tried to do is focus on the speed of iteration that they can bring through our stack. Because some of these answers are already known to them. Like the business head or the monetization head at the publisher already knows that if I could try, you know, AppLovin alongside a Google ad manager, maybe I could get more, right? They already know this. But there is a dependency on tech because this can't be done so easily, because it has to be integrated. There is some logic that has to be written. Then you have to go back and release the app that needs approvals, because now you're going to change a lot of things on the underlying code. Something might break, etc., etc. Your revenue may get impacted. So it's about how seamlessly, how quickly, how easily can you make this transition or do this iteration rather. So that's where we focus. One of the things that we talk about is not just the ease of implementation of our stack, but also the kind of flexibility, the power that it gives them in terms of trying different things and new things, like try a new network for improving your fill rate. Try putting, at least some of these networks in competition for the same ad opportunity at the same time, so that you know that, your ECPMs might also go up. So those are levers that we use typically in conversations, and we show them using data that they have that, this could be a, much better outcome for them if they were to sort of, go with this.
Right. I think the point of the inability to experiment, even though there is a lot of knowledge and the capability, just the fact that they could not or they cannot experiment is a major bottleneck in terms of driving more ad revenue. So Meta Mediation, Ranga, I'll come to you for this. So this is not a plug and play, fit it and forget it kind of a thing. So either you are a brand new publisher or an app developer getting into Meta Mediation, or a mid-level or an enterprise one. So you need to be a keen student with an experimentative mindset to actually squeeze more out of this. Is it fair to say that?
It is a plug and play. I wouldn't say it is not a plug and play solution, right? It is a plug and play solution because when you talk about meta mediation, it is like we already spoke what it means, right? But our SDK comes along with pretty much everything a developer is going to do to run experiments, right? So basically you implement the SDK and forget about it from an engineering perspective. Correct? It is up to finally the monetization manager, whether he wants to tweak it a little bit more, whether he's happy with how it is performing and all that stuff. But I would not say it is not. It is a plug and play. I wouldn't say it is.
From an engineering perspective, it is absolute simple integration and plug and play. But in terms of experimentation, yes, until and unless the monetization team or the leader actually experiments, because that is where
But that is how the role is, right? If you think about a monetization guy, he is always looking at numbers on a daily basis or a weekly basis, monthly basis, sometimes even on an hourly basis.
No, the comparison what I'm trying to make is, if my primary focus is to bring more people to my app, drive the traffic, keep people there, while ad revenue is a nice to have, versus somebody who has
why
to be
would you
mentally
say it is a
prepared.
nice to have, right? So I'm going to ask you the same question back, right? Why is it not nice to have, right? It is. I mean, I built an app for a certain thing, right? But eventually the app is also going to move forward with the monetization built into it, right? It is not a nice to have. Unless you are an app which is, I don't know any app which doesn't have any ads in it today. Maybe the Instagram has ads, right? If you think about it, right? Everybody will use Instagram whether you show ads or not, irrespective of it, right? TikTok has. I don't know why would you think that it is nice to have. It is a must have, I think, at some point of time. Whether how much ads am I going to show is what I would think, right? How many slots I actually define, what kind of ads do I want to show, whether it is engagement wise, whether it spoils the engagement of the app. So that is where I would look at it, right? Okay, can I have 4 slots or should I keep it to 2 slots? Can I do an app open ad or should I do an interstitial or a rewarded ad? So lots of rewarded ad doesn't make sense in a normal content publisher, right? What are the reward you're going to get? Nothing, right? But if you're a game developer, then the rewarded ad makes sense because you do something, you get back to the level, something like that, right? So I wouldn't say it is nice to have. Must have. I'm not because we are doing meta mediation. I'm just saying because I think if I am an app developer, I will still do ads, right? Maybe I might optimize it more, but I'm going to do ads.
Fair. I think that's a fair comment. I think, Girish, you mentioned about the metrics that will eventually grow. While we do our best behind the scenes to improve the render rates, the fill rates and the eCPMs should naturally grow over a period of time. However, for publishers who introduce meta mediation. So, in let's say a line or two, what does success look like for a publisher with meta mediation?
So, quite frankly, an increase in revenue, obviously, but also this entire efficiency. So, revenue comes because revenue is the outcome. The actual cause of that outcome is because you are improving the efficiency. 12% that we talked about as a number was the efficiency of your ad serving, right? Fill rate is a function of how many networks, how many people participate in the auction. Your render rate is purely a function of how well you are optimizing your entire stack to show the ad. And your eCPMs are a function of, again, how many people are competing, but also your understanding of how the demand is moving over a period of time. So do you have a dynamic way of altering CPMs? Like there could be a seasonal shift which requires you to lower your expectations on eCPMs in the interest of higher fill rates, right? Eventually to ensure that revenue grows, right? So that's all, I would say revenue engineering on the publisher side, but not something that they need to consciously focus on as much, because these are things that, automatically from a meta mediation standpoint is already happening and being done.
So think about it this way, right? So I implement meta mediation, right? So my ad engineering comes down to almost a zero today, right? So the apps don't have to put any effort on ads engineering. So one is getting higher revenues, whatever, all the 12%, 14%, 20% increase and all that stuff, right? But think about the bottom line, right? You don't have to put any more ad engineers, right? You don't have to put any more engineers on making this one work, do all this experiment. All this just goes away. It's just out of the box for you. So if I've saved on 2 engineers, I've saved on 2 engineers, man, that is bottom line. Forget the revenue uplift.
That is absolutely true. Girish, with Adster's experience of introducing meta mediation to publishers and the conversations you guys have been having, any common mistakes you see publishers make while implementing solutions? I don't know if Ranga, you're the right one, or Girish to answer this. Anything?
I can take a stab and then Ranga can also jump in. So when we talk about common mistakes, right, everybody on the publisher side is obviously anxious, right? Anxious for outcomes, anxious for results. Sometimes one has to be patient to see the data for what it is, right? So we have had, for example, publishers come and tell us, the number of ads have increased. What we were talking about earlier. The number of ads increased because you became more efficient, more impressions are getting monetized. It is not because the ad opportunities or the ad slots increased. You have the same number of ad slots. You are able to show more ads because you become better at calling the networks, better at running the auction, better at showing the ad, right? So when we talk about common misconceptions, it's also about understanding what is happening, within this entire, meta mediation stack. It is understanding where the efficiency is coming from. It is understanding what the outcomes are. And it is also knowing that, these outcomes are driving what my objectives were from a business standpoint. So it's largely a function of them staying the course also, because we talked about this being 8 to 9 weeks from a overall, journey perspective. So during this period, I think we have to constantly use data to benchmark and understand where we were. Have we become better or worse? And what are the objectives or outcomes we're driving? I'll speak about just one other one quickly and then I hand it over to Ranga. Is this entire thing. So our North Star metric is revenue, which I talked about as the objective or the outcome we want. Increase in revenue. Now fundamentally, this can come from the 3 levers that we spoke about just a few minutes back. you cannot be focused only on one of those levers and ignore the other two. For example, we've seen a lot of publishers who flip a switch, obviously because the number of impressions go up, the number of the fill gets better, your ECPMs may momentarily decline, right? You cannot use that alone as the yardstick, because you have to see the full formula for what it is and see that the revenue is increasing, which is what you wanted in the first place, right? And that's the part that I think publishers also need to understand, as to what is happening. It can't be a knee-jerk reaction saying, oh, today CPMs went up or they went down or something went off. It has to be seen in the full context of what is happening within the ad stack and use data to analyze it and then see what the desired direction in which they're moving.
Fair enough.
So, I've seen apps where the general revenues are dips over the weekend and then picks back up over the weekdays, right? It depends on what kind of app it is, right? Like, don't want to give any examples, but just saying in that sense. So they see suddenly a dip on a weekend. Obviously, the dip is going to be there, irrespective of whether Meta Mediation was there or not there, right? It is also the function of number of users coming onto the app over the weekend, or maybe it is a weekday, right? People go to office, people sit on trains or wherever they sit and use that app. So that I've seen people suddenly say, oh, it has come down over the weekend, but it goes back. But that is the general trend of the app by itself, right? So not necessarily because Meta Mediation was introduced.
Fair enough. Girish, I think so far this concept of meta mediation is something which we have been taking to publishers, educating them, driving awareness. How long, this is quite speculative, but how long, if I have to ask you to be speculative, how long do you think will it take for publishers to realize and say, they take the step forward and say, do you have this? Which means awareness is widespread. And so how long do you think at an industry level for this to happen?
If you can speculate it perfectly, then I'll buy whatever stock is buying.
It's a hard one to sort of nail down, but just going by general trends and the way, so our industry is a very fast evolving one, right? There are a number of things that it's so dynamic. There's a lawsuit against, there's a DOJ versus Google lawsuit that's happening as we speak, and something or the other is changing on a daily basis in this entire ecosystem in the industry. But if I had to just look at, and we've had the benefit of having the last 2 years to see how things have moved and what changes have actually happened, I think the adoption has increased in the sense that publishers have started to become more aware, and the term itself is not new to them, right? So they recognize what meta mediation is. The term they recognize. They may not completely fathom how it works, what it does, etc., what all it happens. But for us to get to that level, I think given the conversations that are happening in a lot more communities, people talking about them on discussion boards, communities, publisher forums, so on and so forth, it's probably going to get there in another year and a half is what I foresee, as far as seeing that groundswell happening, right? Where you see a sizable number of publishers, and especially with the larger ones, beginning to take that step forward, because they realize that, oh my God, this, even with our large teams, and this is something we've seen just over the last, 3 to 4 months, a lot more larger publishers with whom we have been having conversations have suddenly come back to the table and said, I'm now ready to try this. Because it's taken time for the idea to soak in, for them to understand, these are the same challenges that, we are now experiencing that they talked about, or we've been experiencing now, and it's become more acute. So the propensity to try has now started to go up even with the larger ones. And as the larger ones jump on the bandwagon and start reaping the benefits, word is definitely going to get out, and that's the best way for it to also spread. It doesn't need advertising again. People have to share their experiences and talk about it and say this is how it's making a difference to our lives.
Ranga, from an engineer's perspective, in terms of what is your advice to developers and engineers to keep an eye out for monetization technologies like this? For example, I see quite a few conferences dedicated to engineers in many industries, for example, in streaming and VOD, and very few engineers and developers actually get time But passively, they can consume through podcasts. They can listen to us. They can read our blogs. What is one piece of advice you would give to engineers?
Maybe the only other piece of advice is just don't look at it from an engineering perspective. Look at it from real numbers perspective, right? Because I saw documentation, I read documentation, I implemented it, right? But what does it do, right? Do you actually go look at your console, look at the reports, see whether the change that you made, or you're waiting for somebody else to tell you what the numbers look like, right? I know some of them might have access, some of them might not have access, but I would think generally, right, if I did something, I want to see what the results look like. I wouldn't just look at the documentation, implement the SDK and forget about it. So I would really want to see, okay, what is it contributing to it, right, sir? This is a very generic piece of advice. I wouldn't think it is for ad world only, but it is normal anywhere. Any engineer would generally say, I've done this one, let somebody else look at it.
Not necessarily implementation, but the impact.
Whether it is positive or negative, irrespective of it.
There are obviously communities and groups that are available to engineers, and I'm sure a ton of them, and just looking at the questions that they pose on these communities like Reddit, for example, which has an AdMob community, which has a programmatic community, they're facing these struggles are very real, and they're not alone in these challenges, right? So I think coming out and opening up about this and talking about it and asking the right kind of questions with respect to what they're encountering is probably the best way to learn. In terms of resources, there are a dime a dozen, fewer for meta mediation. So obviously, we are doing our bit, and if people can, follow us, look at our blogs, and look at the content that we are putting out there, there's a lot of learning in that content. And I think essentially it's also about experimenting. And once they start doing that and they sort of figure out who the right people are in the industry who can help them in that direction, then they're going to sort of get more. But like Ranga and we were just talking, iterations, you cannot stop iterating because it is difficult. That is the main message that I think goes out to all this.
Girish, Ranga, thank you so much for breaking down what could have been a very technical topic into something our audience can actually understand and act on it. This has been incredibly educational. I think a lot of awareness, as we have alluded to in this episode, is required about this topic.